king of German mercenaries.
Chapter 287, The Old One has run away, let's catch the young one. It was getting dark, but Marin had no intention of resting. Instead, he led his 6,000 men and rode north non-stop, intending to travel overnight and try to intercept the 4,000 Saxon troops that surrounded Emden. In this decisive battle, the 10,000 troops under Marin suffered only 500 or 600 casualties in total, and these were mainly losses in the early artillery bombardment and the later general offensive. The Saxons were different. More than 1,400 plate knights died in battle or died from serious injuries, and nearly 2,000 plate knights were taken prisoner. The remaining 1,000 plate knights either fled eastward with the Duke of Saxony or swam across the river to escape. As for the infantry, the Saxons suffered even greater losses. Of the 15,000 Saxon infantry, more than 2,900 were killed in battle or died of injuries. Among them, more than 700 were casualties caused by the trampling of the Saxon army after its defeat. As for the remaining 12,000 people, a small number of them escaped by swimming, but 11,000 people laid down their weapons and became Marin's prisoners. There were also 15,000 civilians on the opposite side, and Marin sent 2,000 people to pursue them. Those civilians were very timid, had basically no combat effectiveness, and had no weapons. Although there were 15,000 people, 2,000 soldiers were enough to scare them. The only problem was whether 2,000 people were enough to capture people. If Marin led the main force to chase, the 15,000 civilians would definitely not be able to escape. But because Marin had to lead the main force back to Emden, he could only send 2,000 people across the river to chase. In this way, because the number of pursuers was not enough, Marin did not know how many people he could capture. Why did Marin rush back to rescue Emden? It was not because Marin was worried that Adler could not hold on, but because the highest commander of the Saxon army besieging Emden was George, the eldest son and heir of the Duke of Saxony. The old fox, the Duke of Saxony, fled lightly, and Marin did not have enough cavalry to chase him. He could only sigh at their backs. However, George's 4,000 men were different. Although George's 4,000 Saxon troops were regular troops, they were useless because Adler had the advantage of tall and solid city walls. Although they were all militia, they could hold out for 10 days or half a month. What Marin cares about is George. As long as he catches George, Marin will have the capital to make various conditions to the Duke of Saxony. It can be said that as the first heir to the Duchy of Saxony, similar to the crown princes of those kingdoms, George's value is still very high. If he is caught, he can make more confident conditions. Moreover, it was not easy for George's army to encircle Saxony, because his army needed to cross the Ems River. The Ems River is different from the Leda River. The Leda River is just a small to medium-sized river and a tributary of the Ems River. The Ems River, on the other hand, is one of the largest rivers in Germany. In particular, Emden is located in the lower reaches of the Ems River, close to the estuary, where the river is very wide. It was not realistic to build a floating bridge over such a wide river. Therefore, George's army used many ships to transport people across the river. The ships were parked just east of Emden, only about 15 kilometers away from the battlefield in Lisle County. If they hurried, they could arrive at midnight. The arrival mentioned here refers to the place where the enemy landed. What are they going there for? Of course, they are going to seize the boats that the Saxons used to cross the river. As long as they seized those ships under cover of night and surrounded George and his troops in Emden, they would lose their retreat route. When the Marin army arrived, George and his men would be unable to escape from the attack from both inside and outside. However, in order to prevent George from escaping by boat, Marlin specially sent someone to inform Captain Kidd to help repair the pontoon bridge and then immediately head north overnight to the water near Emden to prevent George from following his father's example and escaping in a small boat. When Captain Kidd's fleet destroyed the Saxon pontoon bridge, they only burned the boats close to the Saxon army's battle formation, but did not touch the boats close to the civilian station on the south bank. Anyway, in such a critical situation, Marin did not think that the civilians on the other side of the river would have the courage to risk their lives and row across the river to help, and the fact was indeed so. After the main battle was decided, Captain Kidd and his men gathered the remaining ships on the south bank of the Leda River and started to build a floating bridge. Then, the 3 warships left the Leda River, and then, they received Marin's order. Their next task was very simple, which was to patrol the estuary area and stop any small boats running out from East Frisia to prevent George from mixing in. After the deployment was completed, Marin's army arrived at the landing site of the Saxon army stationed in West Frisia, more than 10 kilometers away, at midnight and saw a large number of Saxon ships. Moreover, at this time, the Saxons on the entire temporary dock had basically fallen asleep. Under the horrified eyes of the Saxons, Marin suddenly appeared with a large army, seized the entire temporary dock, and controlled more than 100 large and small West Frisian ships. In this way, the Saxons' escape route by ship was cut off. Then, Marin ordered his men, except those on night duty, to rest and wait for the arrival at Emden the next day to surround and intercept George's army. George was also stupid. According to the original plan of the Duke of Saxony, he should have organized the fleet to land and besiege the city of Emden after receiving the news of the outcome of the main battlefield in Lisle County. However, the arrogant George believed that the Saxon main force could not lose when they had twice as many people as the enemy and had many plate knights. So, that morning, after learning that the Saxon army and Marin's army had come into contact, he took his troops and began to land a few kilometers east of Emden city without authorization, and in the afternoon, surrounded the city of Emden guarded by Adler. Then, when the Saxon army collapsed, no one sent a letter to George to inform him of the bad news. So George, who was besieging Emden triumphantly, did not know that his wily father had already fled. In the middle of the night, when Marin's main force arrived at the temporary landing site of the Saxon army, because it was a night attack, the hundreds of auxiliary troops guarding the temporary dock were captured by Marin's men in their sleep. Therefore, no one escaped to inform George. So, when Marin suddenly appeared from behind with 6,000 troops on the morning of December 16, George was in a state of panic. Similarly, his Saxon soldiers were also confused. In the eyes of George and the Saxon soldiers, their duke was a man of both military and political skills, and was omnipotent. Therefore, they never thought that the Duke of Saxony, who brought twice the army, would lose. Therefore, they did not consider that Marin would return with a large army to help. Because they thought that at this time, Marin would either be killed or captured directly on the battlefield, or retreat into the county of Lisle after being defeated, and rely on the city wall to block the Saxon army. Therefore, they never thought that Marin would solve the Saxon army on the same day and return with a large army to help the next day. Therefore, the Saxon army, led by George, surrounded Emden, but did not guard against the support of Marin's army. Because they thought it was impossible. When Marin's army appeared, all the Saxons felt stunned and unbelievable. Chapter 288 Taking the opportunity to grab Marin looked down on Prince George. As the heir to the powerful Duchy of Saxony, Prince George's abilities were actually very average, and he was far inferior to his wily father. Duke Albrecht of Saxony took great pains to conquer West Frisia, but after just a dozen years in George's hands, he was cornered by the Duchy of Geddes and finally sold West Frisia to Charles V. You know, in terms of national strength, the Duchy of Geddes is far behind the Duchy of Saxony. Apart from anything else, as an important part of the second largest business circle of the Hanseatic League, the Duchy of Saxony has a fiscal revenue that is far beyond the Duchy of Geddes. Although the Principality of Geddes occupies the fertile land at the mouth of the Rhine, it is only an agricultural country. How can the finances of an agricultural country be compared with those of an industrial and commercial country? George, who had rich industrial and commercial tax revenues, was finally forced into disgrace by the princes of an agricultural country. His ability was really poor. You know, this is the era of mercenaries, and money is king. Whoever has more money can hire more troops. It can be said that the army that Saxony can muster is definitely not comparable to that of the Duchy of Geddes. So, George's inability to defeat the Duchy of Geddes is obviously a problem of its ability. And the facts have proved this point. After seeing Marin bringing 6,000 troops to support, Prince George was so scared that he forgot to respond. Then, Marin's army quickly defeated the Saxon army south of Emden, recaptured the port of Emden, and controlled the ships in the port, preventing the Saxons from escaping by ship. Then, Marin sent his main force to the east of Emden, where George, holding the general's flag, was, and laid siege with all his strength. In fact, the morale of the Saxon army had already dropped to the freezing point before the battle began, because the fact that Marin could bring back a large army proved that the Duke of Saxony had failed on the front line. In panic, George the Fool forgot to gather the troops surrounding Emden together to resist. Therefore, the Saxon army had only about 1,000 people in each direction. Therefore, Marin, with 6,000 people, only needed to attack 1,000 people each time. When more than 5,000 soldiers surrounded the main force of the Saxony Groningen garrison of more than 1,000 outside the east city, the timid George saw that he could not win, so he surrendered honestly after a brief resistance. The commander had surrendered, so what was the Saxon army in the north and west of the city doing? So the Saxon army in the north and west of the city also surrendered. In this way, Marin almost didn't waste much time and dealt with George and the 4,000 Saxon troops he led in half a day. To be honest, if these 4,000 Saxon troops were gathered together and led by a more powerful commander, it would not be easy for Marin's 6,000 people to take them down. Because Marin's army is good at defense, not good at attack. In this duel with the Duke of Saxony, if Marin had not taken advantage of the opportunity when the high platform where the Duke of Saxony was located was destroyed by artillery shells, and used the Saxon fleeing soldiers to attack the enemy formation, Marin would not have been able to defeat the Saxon army in just one day. The 4,000 Saxon troops led by Prince George were all regular troops. If they were to gather together for defense, even though Marin had more people, it would take several days to achieve victory. But who told George to be too arrogant? Before the main battlefield was decided, he crossed the river in advance and surrounded Emden in 4 parts, giving Marin the opportunity to defeat them one by one. If Marin was in George's position, when the Saxon army in the south of the city was attacked, he would definitely withdraw his troops to the north of the city first and join the Saxon army in the north of the city. Then, he would gather the Saxon army in the west of the city to defend on the spot. However, George, who was not smart enough, was stunned. He watched Marin deal with the Saxon army in the south of the city and then surrounded him. After defeating the Saxon army that surrounded Emden, Marin did not rest, but asked Adler to take care of the prisoners, while he himself took the army and George, an important prisoner, boarded the ship and crossed the river to Groningen. Groningen is now in the hands of George, and the defenders in the city are also George's men. Marin controls George's trump card, so he naturally cannot waste it. The next day, Marin brought George to the city of Groningen, causing great chaos in the city. At first, George refused to order the general to open the city gate, but Marin was not a pushover. Marin pretended to be fierce, took out a sharp knife, cut a bloody mark on George's neck, and acted as if he was going to kill him on the spot. George collapsed, and as a last resort, he began to loudly order the general guarding the city to open the city gate. The officer guarding the city was originally George's squire knight, so he naturally couldn't bear to see George being killed. In desperation, he opened the gate of Groningen. Then, Marin led his army and marched into the city. Of course, Marin was not stupid enough to allow his soldiers to rob. He first found out the distribution of power in the city and which nobles owned certain shops. Then, he hung black cross flags on the properties of other nobles to remind the soldiers not to offend them. Then, the organized looting began. However, Marin ordered that unless someone resisted with a weapon, no one should be killed. Also, raping women was absolutely prohibited. At the same time, when looting ordinary people's homes, no food should be taken. Even if the other party had a lot of food, only half of it could be taken. Finally, robbing the poor was absolutely prohibited. The reason for this is that Marin wants to occupy West Frisia in the future. Therefore, Marin does not want to make a mortal enemy with the locals. Otherwise, when he controls this place in the future, he will face social instability. In addition, Marin specifically requested that all livestock, carriages, artillery, and bronze for making artillery in the city must be looted. For 2 days, except for some well-known shops in Groningen, all other houses were looted to some extent. But Marin was very sensible, the most particular robber among the medieval robbers. During this period, Marin's men also captured Kanu, the illegitimate son of the Sexner family, who was used by. After catching him, Marin was too lazy to talk nonsense and directly hanged Kanu. Marin has never been soft-hearted towards those who threaten his position. 2 days later, Marin finished looting Groningen. Then, he changed from a robber to a philanthropist and began to use the looted food to help the poor and orphans. Then, Marin left a phalanx of people to garrison Groningen, and many others were sent out of the city to the north to plunder the Frisian fishermen on the coast. For Marin, developing the navy is an important aspect. Therefore, being able to control more fishermen will also make it easier for him to select sailors. After arranging everything, Marin returned to Auric with the people of the first phalanx as guards. At this point, the war between Saxony and East Frisia finally came to an end. The result was a surprise to the outside world. Marin, who was originally unpopular with everyone, not only won, but also won a big victory in such a short time, which surprised everyone. Chapter 289. The lion opens his mouth. When Marin sent people to plunder West Frisia, the frightened Duke of Saxony had already fled to the Duchy of Lüneburg, which had a bad relationship with the Duchy of Saxony. The Duchy of Lüneburg is a famous salt-producing area in Germany. The city of Lüneburg was built on a large salt mine. As the second largest business district of the Hanseatic League, Saxony naturally attaches great importance to Lüneburg, a major salt-producing country. Because in the Middle Ages, salt was a very important bulk and high-value commodity. After arriving at the Duchy of Lüneburg, the Duke of Saxony quickly sent his men to go to Groningen to inform George to retreat. However, he did not expect that when his men arrived in West Frisia, they received the unfavorable news that George was captured and West Frisia was occupied by Marin. The Duke of Saxony was terrified when he learned about it. He was mentally prepared for the defeat of the army. However, he was very embarrassed about the capture of his eldest son. Because his eldest son was the legal heir to the Duchy of Saxony. The capture of the eldest son not only dealt a severe blow to the reputation of the Duchy of Saxony, but also forced the Duke of Saxony to pay a very high price to redeem him. At this time, the Duke of Saxony no longer had the courage to send people to negotiate with Marin. Because he knew that Marin would definitely ask for a high price. However, he had to talk, because most of his troops were captured by Marin. If he didn't redeem them, the Duchy of Saxony would not have enough troops to protect itself. What's more serious is that if he doesn't redeem his men, no one will be willing to fight for him in the future. Especially those knights, if they don't have conscripts, they can just go to the farms in the countryside and catch them at will. But knights are different. Even trainee knights without titles are reserve nobles and cannot be caught at will. Moreover, these people are free and have the right to choose to serve other nobles. Only those nobles who have accepted the Duke of Saxony's fiefdoms are obliged to fight for the Duke of Saxony. But if the Duke of Saxony does not redeem them when they are captured, his nobles will have reason to rebel. Marin was very happy these days. After winning the battle, he returned to Auric. But his troops were not idle. Marin arranged 2,000 people to pursue the 15,000 Saxon civilians who stayed south of the Leda River during the war, and captured 10,000 of them. As for the remaining 5,000 people, they took advantage of the chaos to escape. Marin was helpless about this. If he had not been in a hurry to capture George, and the whole army had crossed the river to chase him, 5,000 civilians would not have escaped. However, it was a big surprise to be able to capture 10,000 civilians. You know, these civilians recruited by the Duke of Saxony are all strong men, and they are all very strong. It just so happens that Marin needs a lot of labor to dig ditches in the country. Originally, there were only more than 20,000 able-bodied men in the entire East Frisia. Now, with the sudden addition of 10,000 Saxon militiamen, Marin was extremely surprised. Moreover, many of the 20,000 strong men in East Frisia have their own jobs. For example, bakers have to make bread for the people of the country every day, bricklayers have to repair houses for people in need every day, carpenters and blacksmiths have to make various tools for people every day, and fishermen have to go out to sea to fish every day. In short, everyone has their own things to do. Only those serfs have time to be recruited to dig ditches. Marin estimated that there are about 10,000 young and strong serfs. Moreover, even these serfs only have time to dig ditches during the slack season. Otherwise, it will delay agricultural production. But the 10,000 captured Saxon militiamen were different. They were prisoners of war, and it was not excessive for Marin to detain them for labor for a few years. In fact, Marin only needed to provide them with food and did not need to pay them wages. Because they were prisoners of war, their status was almost the same as slaves. In the Middle Ages, after obtaining prisoners of war, only knights and nobles above the rank of knight would be treated preferentially and wait for the other party to pay money to redeem them. As for the conscripted soldiers, the more merciful nobles disliked them for wasting food and would release them directly. And the more vicious nobles, in order to attack the opponent's mobilization ability and for fear of wasting food, would even kill a large number of conscripted captives from civilian origin. In this way, the opponent will be able to recruit fewer infantry in the next war. At the same time, they do not need to waste a lot of food to feed these prisoners. Moreover, there are many people who do this, and no one even blames them for this practice. Because, in this era, the lives of civilians are very humble, and no one cares if they die. Marin's plan was not very merciful, but it was definitely not vicious. Before, the reason why many of the 15,000 Saxon militiamen desperately fled, and 5,000 of them escaped, was because they were afraid of being killed. Because, in order to save food, it was not uncommon to kill those civilian captives who could not be exchanged for ransom. Even those militiamen had heard of many similar tragedies. So, when they saw Marin's army crossing the river to capture people, in order to survive, many Saxon militiamen ran away like crazy, and as many as 5,000 people ran away in one breath. Moreover, not only these 10,000 Saxon civilians, Marin also captured 1,980 Saxon knights, including those lent to the Duke of Saxony by the Elector of Saxony, and 15,000 infantry, including 4,000 regular Saxon infantry led by George. Marin must be waiting for the Duke of Saxony to redeem the 1,980 knights. As for the 15,000 infantry captives, Marin thinks that the Duke of Saxony will probably redeem 7,000 of the regular infantry. As for the other 8,000 conscripts, the Duke of Saxony may not have the money to redeem them. Because just redeeming George and the 1,980 knights will drain the Duke of Saxony's purse. As for the 7,000 regular infantry, they are the guarantee of the security of the Duchy of Saxony and West Frisia. Therefore, even if the Duke of Saxony borrows money, he will find a way to redeem those knights and regular infantry. As for those conscripts and civilians, Marin doesn't think the Duke of Saxony has the money to redeem them. Because, if the 1,980 knights alone were worth 500 gold coins each, that would be close to 1 million gold coins. Adding the very valuable George and the 7,000 infantry, Marin was sure that he would make a fortune this time. As for the 10,000 civilians and 8,000 conscripts, the Duke of Saxony didn't care whether to redeem Marin or not. Anyway, Marin didn't think the Duke of Saxony had so much money to redeem these unimportant civilians. Marin would be happy if the Duke of Saxony didn't redeem these people. In this way, he would have enough manpower to dig ditches and ditches to transform the swamps in East Frisia. With 18,000 able-bodied men digging ditches and ditches all day long, Marin estimated that the swamps in the territory could be transformed within 2 or 3 years. When Henry I, Duke of Lüneburg, came to negotiate with Marin on behalf of the Duke of Saxony, Marin really asked for a lot. Marin proposed that Prince George be priced at 300,000 gold coins, who said he was just a prince. If the Duke of Saxony himself was captured, Marin would have directly asked for 1 million gold coins, and each knight would be discounted by 500 gold coins. In this way, the total price of Prince George and 1,980 knights alone reached 1.29 million gold coins. As for the 7,000 regular infantry, Marin was more generous and offered 50 gold coins each. But because there were too many people, the total price reached 350,000 gold coins. As for the 8,000 conscripts and 10,000 civilians, Marin did not offer a price, and Duke Henry of Lüneburg did not ask. It seemed that both sides had forgotten about them. In addition, Marin did not offer a price for the 2,600 war horses and more than 4,000 draft horses he captured, because he had no intention of returning them. Even so, the total price offered by Marin was very scary. Prince George, the Saxon knights and those regular infantry, the total price reached 1.64 million gold coins. These are nothing, the most important thing is that Marin proposed to ask the Duke of Saxony to cede Friesland. And this is the real lion's big mouth.